안녕하세요. Greetings and welcome 8th graders. Today our topic is glaciers. So our objectives for today are to understand what glaciers are and how they change the earth. And our language objective is to be able to explain how glaciers change the landscape. So glaciers are giant slow-moving sheets of ice formed by repeated snowfall. So if we think of sedimentary rocks, right, they are formed by sediment piling up, and compressing, and eventually that sediment will reform into crystals because of that pressure. That's the exact same thing that happens with a glacier. If you get snow and you pile it up again and again and you push down on it enough, eventually that snow is going to form ice. You can see this outside, like in parking lots or on the steps during the school year, during the winter. Snow piles up, people walk on it and walk on it and walk on it, and eventually it becomes a slick sheet of ice. So anyways, that's what happens with glaciers, although that ice formation is formed just by simply the pressure of snow piling up and piling up over the years. There are two types of glaciers, alpine and continental. Alpine glaciers are found in the mountains, and we can see this glacier, which is kind of running, it's forming at the top of the mountain and it's running down to the bottom of the mountain. I'll go ahead and just highlight that for you. I'll just kind of draw a little shape here. So this thing here that's running down the mountain, it's an ice sheet. That's a glacier. That's an alpine glacier. There are also continental glaciers. Continental glaciers cover large continents. Right now, the two big continental glaciers that we have on Earth are the glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica. However, during the last ice age, which I don't know, maybe 13,000 years ago, there were ice sheets covering North America, Europe, and Siberia. And so those also were continental ice sheets. So glaciers are another force that can really shape the Earth's landscape. Glaciers are gigantic. Glaciers are so huge and so heavy, they actually make the Earth's crust sort of sag beneath them in some places. Here we have a picture of a glacier in, I believe this is in South America. And we can see these, that's like a close-up image of people on top of that glacier. It's just a tremendously large glacier. When glaciers eventually find their way to the sea, then large pieces of glaciers break off and float away, becoming icebergs. Here we have another picture of a glacier. This again is in South America. And finally, we're looking at a diagram of glaciers in both Greenland and Antarctica. So Greenland's glacier is about 3 kilometers thick, and in Antarctica, the thickest area of that glacier is 4 kilometers thick. So there's just a tremendous amount of ice that's sort of captured and retained in these glaciers. And I should say it's not just ice, but it's fresh water. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how glaciers shape the landscape. So glaciers move, and they move very slowly. It's kind of a phrase or like a colloquialism to talk about something that's happening slowly is happening at a glacial pace or at a glacial rate. Okay, but glaciers move, they only move like, I don't know, a few centimeters every year. But because they're moving, they're able to move, and because they're so gigantic, they have a lot of momentum, they have a lot of inertia, even though they're very slow moving. So nonetheless, point being is they can pick up very heavy things and move them very far. And so they're pushing giant rocks and all kinds of debris underneath them as they're moving. And what this in turn what this does in turn is sort of scrape anything that's soft below it, pick it up and move it as well. So it scrapes rock, soil, and debris. And here we have an image of sort of abrasion marks that are made by a glacier. Here's kind of a diagram showing what happens when a glacier is moving. And lastly, as I mentioned, glaciers can pick up giant rocks and move them for miles. And so this is a picture of a rock that's been moved and placed there by a glacier. So when a glacier melts, it can leave lakes behind, and this is actually one way that the Great Lakes had formed. Was a large ice sheet moved across the continent of North America. It sort of scraped up the soft materials in the area around the Great Lakes, and when the glaciers began to melt, those sort of depressions that were formed by the movement of this glacier began to fill up with water, and what we're left with is the Great Lakes. Here is a picture of some lakes that are formed by a retreating glacier, and this is kind of a diagram of what happened with the Great Lakes. So glaciers not only shaped the Great Lakes in general, but they specifically shaped Minnesota. If you've been to the Mississippi River, you can see that the Mississippi River actually has very, very wide banks. And this is because the Mississippi River was much, 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 much bigger a long time ago. Back when we had the last ice age kind of finishing, a giant lake, Lake Agassiz, formed in the area covering Minnesota, North Dakota, and a very large part of Canada. This was a tremendously big lake, and this lake drained into the Mississippi River and also drained into an area up north towards the Arctic Ocean. Nonetheless, because this was such a huge lake, the runoff from the lake made the Mississippi River much, much, much bigger. If we look at the Mississippi River today, and this is a great image because it'll show you like where the banks of the river are. So if we look here at the end, this is one bank of the Mississippi River, and if we look over here, this is another bank of the Mississippi River. And the river itself is actually kind of a smaller portion in the middle, but when Lake Agassiz was draining into the Mississippi River, water went from bank to bank in the Mississippi River, so it was a much larger river back then. And here we can see kind of an image of exactly how large the Mississippi River was when Lake Agassiz was draining into it. So another way that glaciers have shaped the landscape is U-shaped valleys for alpine glaciers. And so usually in mountainous areas you have V-shaped valleys. It's just because these valleys sort of form this way because of erosion and weathering. So as weathered rock is carried off, it creates a V-shaped valley. However, what glaciers do is they go in there and they tear through the landscape, and what you end up with is these sort of bowl depressions, these U-shaped valleys. Glaciers are also a very important part of our geological record. Glaciers leave evidence of how our world looked millions and millions of years ago. And so one example of this is the continent of Pangaea. If we look at different continents today, like Africa, South America, India, and Australia, we can see evidence of glaciers on those continents. And we can see, if you look at the arrows, these arrows show you in which direction the glaciers were moving. However, the position of the continents now doesn't make sense in relation to these glacier marks. For instance, if we look at India, India is actually it's located very close to the equator, but it has glacier marks running from the south to the north. And so what that means is that if India never moved due to plate tectonics, if it was always in the same place, then there was a glacier that was moving from the equator northwards. And so that really doesn't make sense at all. And this was one of the pieces of evidence that was used to support Wegener's theory about plate tectonics. So for our exit ticket, we have some questions for you. Choose two of these questions and post your answers on Schoology. So I'm going to show you 4 questions. Your job is to answer 2. Okay, don't answer all 4. Just answer 2 of these questions. So first, what is a glacier? How are glaciers formed? What effect do glaciers have on the landscape? And our last question, how did glaciers affect the landscape of Minnesota? So go ahead, answer two of those questions, two questions of your choosing. Post it on Schoology, and if you have any questions, as usual, please contact me at sjkwok@sejongacademy.org, or you can always contact Mr. O at hoh1@sejongacademy.org. I also have office hours every day from 9:30 a.m. until 10:30 a.m. Thanks. Peace.